that frustrates me. We talk sometimes about the government's finances as though it's like a current account, as though, you know, or you've only got £2 left in the account. So that's not how it works. It's a political decision to decide to defund youth services, because that's what, you know, no one really uses that term, but that's essentially what's happening. You can't even really make a career these days as a youth worker unless you're willing to work, you know, in one specific position for the whole of your life, and even that position might not be secure. So how are we supposed to build up young people if we can't even build up a workforce around them to support their needs?
All right, thank you for coming to the podcast, Rhammel. How are you today?
Thank you for having me, and I'm feeling great. I mean, slightly tired. It's been a long week, but yeah, I'm feeling good.
Nice, man. Well, you know what? It's interesting, yeah, for anybody listening. So we were just chatting just now, just before we started. Mm-hmm. I spoke with Rhammel, like, I can't remember how I come across your profile, but somehow I came across your profile. I was like, yeah, all right, cool. Gotta get this guy on this podcast. And,
well, I'm here.
Yeah. Well, we spoke, and then I remember I messaged you, I think, on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And then, like, 2-3 days later, I was in the gym working out, and you know that they got the news on the gym. I was like, wait. I know this guy.
Yeah.
It's not, I just spoke to you a few days ago on LinkedIn. So,
yeah. No, I remember that. Yeah. No, I started the year off doing a lot of interviews around a whole host of issues. And do you know what, like, it's hard work, actually, to be honest, engaging with the media, because, as you know, it's not a level playing field out there, and it's just a lot of stress. And some people don't engage because they just don't want to engage. They don't even want to provide a platform to the way in which certain issues are, you know, pushed in the media, basically. And I'm lucky, I'm resilient enough to kind of just decide, you know what, I get that, but someone needs to speak out on these things. So yeah.
It's definitely not a level playing field. That's sort of some of the inspiration behind me starting my 1,000 Voices, where I felt that a lot of the stories were just way too negative, and there isn't enough being done to amplify other narratives, other positive stories. I mean, there is negative sides to it, don't get me wrong, but the overwhelming majority of black people in the UK aren't living the type of life that we see portrayed in certain, you know, movies or where. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not putting that down in it, but I'm saying most people are living pretty regular life, you know, or maybe it's because people do some amazing things, and it's about bringing some of these other narratives to light.
For sure. I completely agree with that, and I think, you know, I reflect back on last year. I was really, like, completely shocked to be recognised as one of the kind of leading black voices in the UK, and there were so many other you know, black people from across the UK, from every nation of the UK, who are doing incredible things. And, you know, you wouldn't know about half of them. Some of them do have a profile, fair enough, but a fair amount of them don't. And it is sad to me that there are so many young and upcoming leaders in the UK across whole hosts of industries. And, you know, where's the time to celebrate them? And, you know, the media picture isn't exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, but it hasn't changed that much. Let's face it, the portrayal of black people is still mostly negative. And you know, the positive portrayal that we do have is quite typecast, so it's very specific. So as you say, it might be kind of movie stars, or okay, but we're not all movie stars. How can we move beyond kind of movie stars or sports people? You know, the great footballers that we now have, that's great, but you know, what about some of those, you know, extraordinary but quite average people that are doing extraordinary things, is what I would say. So yeah, completely frustrating.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in storytelling. I believe that everybody has some sort of story or triumph or success, or I think everybody does, as long if they're not everybody's maybe willing to share in a vulnerable manner like that, but I believe everybody has something that if someone hears it, and someone maybe that can relate to you, same area or field or whatever, they can hear that and be like, right, okay, this person's maybe a bit ahead. They've gone through similar things that I'm going through right now, and they were able to overcome. And again, all of these little things, you know, like, kind of was the inspiration behind
absolutely. And I mean, I think that's why we have to create our own spaces, because one of the things that I find quite interesting, and this cuts across lots of different types of activism in the UK, certainly cuts across LGBT rights. If you look at anti-racism campaigning in the UK and the civil rights movement and all of those sorts of things, I think there's been quite a pivotal change in people not just seeking out visibility and not even just representation, but something a bit more meaningful where people can own a narrative, can shape what it is that they're putting out into the world. And obviously, you know, the democratization of digital and the way that people can start their own podcast like you have, or, you know, whatever it is, has seen a transfer in power. It's not a huge transfer in power, but some transfer in power. But that's why I'm personally invested in those spaces. You know, that's why I'm here to celebrate organizations like UK Black Pride, like the Black Cultural Archives, because ultimately they're the ones that are putting in the work to really showcase what it is that, you know, Black Brits are doing, and it's vast. And that's the one thing I want people to remember and enjoy. But that ultimately that visibility is the bare minimum. But also, kind of what you alluded to, not everyone needs or wants visibility. Not everyone wants to offer that vulnerability and their own story. But there should be a space if they want to. And it should be about us collectively telling our stories. So even if it's someone telling your story on your behalf, it's still through your lens and with the care and attention that's needed that you don't get from mainstream media. Ultimately, there's no care and attention when you go onto these big, you know, I'm not going to single out one particular channel, but when you go onto these singular programs, they're excited for your story because of the money it can make you or because of the views that they're going to get out of it. But are they going to give you the care and attention to take time with what it is that you need to say? And quite often that's just not the case.
And when you paint it like that, it's like it's inherently exploitative. Because it's about like what they can take from it, but it's not about what it might do to you or what you know. It's nothing like that. You know, like when you look at some of these reality TV shows, and for example, people go on and they generate a lot of views for whatever the channel is, and then they cut away, and then they're having just crazy issues, but there's no aftercare. You know?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't experience it on the scale of people who go on things like Love Island, etc. But pretty much my entire time doing media commentary, it doesn't matter what I'm speaking on either. I'll never forget one time I went on what used to be it's now called Politics Live, but back then it was called The Daily Politics, hosted by Andrew Neil and Joe Coburn. And I'll never forget it. Went on and the conversation was about democratic engagement and lowering the voting age and how we can engage young people in democracy. And as happens with lots of shows, obviously it was put online. And I think it was probably the last time that I spent any time looking at what the response was to any of my interviews, because despite the fact that race was nothing to do with it, the amount of racism that was in the comments on the YouTube channel, and yes, you can moderate these things and they get deleted or whatever, but they're still there to start with, right? Same with, Twitter. I use Twitter quite avidly. And ultimately, if I'm speaking about trans rights, if I'm talking about anti-racism, I can expect a whole kind of cohort of people, a small minority to be fair, but a very loud minority to kind of come up against me. And some people kind of compliment me and they're like, you know what, Rhammel, you must be so resilient. And I'm sorry, but there's a few expletives to be said in response to that, because why should I have to be resilient to participate in public life and to talk about issues that I'm passionate about? Why should I need that level of resilience? And you can see, and when we're talking about public life, look at the black MPs and what they need to face, in particular Diane Abbott, and the things that she gets in response to, again, not necessarily talking about racism, any particular issue, and she can expect a barrage of abuse. So yeah, for me, it's crazy that we're still in this situation, and it's sad, really.
I like the way but the way you've explained it quite eloquently. When you talk about having to be, why do you have to feel like you need to be resilient? Like you've been doing this thing for a while, isn't it? Like when I told you just before we started, I was saying that I found a throwback interview.
yeah.
From some time back. You said it was more than 10 years ago or whatnot.
Yeah, it's sad. So I mean, it's sad in the sense that obviously, I mean, it's kind of it's a positive story, but it's sad in the sense that my story really started around about the age of 11, and I started a campaign. So ultimately it was with another friend at the time, and it was called Bridging the Gap, and it was all about the gap that was the gaping gap that still exists between young black men and the police and the criminal justice system. And it was about addressing the manyfold issues, an array of issues, whether it be knife crime, whatever it was, stop and search, all of the same issues that we're talking about in 2023, the same issues issues that came out of, you know, Baroness Casey's review were issues that we were talking about then. And so, yeah, for me, this has been I could never have imagined that I would almost make a career of being somebody who wants to advocate, who wants to campaign on issues. But yeah, for me, that's when it started at 11. And obviously I'm 29 now. So, you know, it has been a long old time.
It's a very long time. Do that from 11 years old. Most 11-year-olds are going to be playing games. Or
we still was, don't get me wrong, I was still playing the games too, but I was out there, you know, saying that ultimately not only do I want a voice, but the people that I connect with want a voice on these issues that affect them. Simple.
Was there like a person that inspired you, or maybe something that happened to you that made you realize, like, all right, from that kind of young age, I'm going to start doing this kind of advocacy work?
Do you know what? I don't think it was individuals. And it's funny when people talk to me about people that inspire me, there are plenty of people. But if I'm honest, I feed off the energy of everyone I meet. Whenever I'm talking about something I'm passionate about, I feed off of that energy. And along the way, people have inspired me. So people like Phil Opokugima, who's the founder of UK Black Pride, people like Ted Brown, who was involved in the gay liberation movement, one of the few black men that we seem to kind of recognize, even though there were obviously others as well, who was involved in the kind of initial kind of LGBT rights movement in the UK, and so the people that have inspired me along the way. But if I'm honest with you, I was inspired and spurred on by my own lived experiences. So, you know, for example, when I started talking about the relationship between young black men and the police, you know, I got to the age of 18 and I've been stopped and searched probably more than 20 times, certainly. And I'll never forget when I did an interview with Ron K. Phillips, who's obviously still I think even now is still a presenter, obviously, with ITV. And she asked me that question, and I said probably about 20. And she was shocked. Bear in mind, she was a news reporter, and even then she was shocked. And it just goes to show that actually for me, you know, there were certain experiences that to me just seemed quite normal, but they just should never have been a norm for me. And I think it was those sorts of lived experiences and the injustice that I felt, or the injustice I experienced with other people and my peers, that made me think, do you know what, like, I'm a passionate person. I was a talker then too, so I'm a talker. How can I put this to use? But also, I think I've always had a slight ethos of like, do you know what? I'm passionate about these things. So what can I do to contribute on this? And I don't think that every young black person growing up in the UK should have to or feel forced to do that. But I do feel that kind of personal obligation, almost like a custodian of the times that we're in. One that is lent to me by many other people to kind of represent and say, do you know what? Things aren't right and things need to be different. And I guess also I think I really believed in my own power to convene as well. Like, how can I bring in other people to the table to have their voice heard? And I think that was always kind of a part of where I grew from, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't say there was an individual. In fact, sadly, I think if you had asked me that same question when I was sort of between 11 and 13, I probably wouldn't have been able to name anybody. And I think that was part of the reason. And I could talk a bit about my other journey later, but part of the reason I've got involved in things is ultimately not seeing those people who looked like me in those spaces. And it's just not good enough.
You know, when you talk about like people being surprised about you telling them you've been stop and search like a number of times, and I think back because that was similar to my experience actually growing up. Where it was just like that. It was just sort of normal, you know, just get a stop and search all the time. And I've had like some mad stop and searches. I've had some, I wouldn't even call it nice inverted commas, stop and search. And I've had like some. I remember one time I was my cousin. And I think two of my cousins and one of my friends were running for the bus. Running for the bus, and then all of a sudden these police, this car skidded in the road, jumped out, falling over, jumped out of the car, came through us on the wall. They said there was a crime. I was like, what was the description of the guys that committed the crime? Like, they couldn't tell us. I'm like, we're running for the bus. Like, come on. But that was mad. Like, the way they handled us was crazy.
And I think it's the interesting thing that you bring that up, because for me it wasn't just the amount of times that I was being stopped and searched, it was the conduct I was experiencing. And I will never forget, I can't even repeat the words actually. I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to repeat some of the words that I remember experiencing when unfortunately one of my friends was wrongfully arrested. I will never forget the conduct. There were people showing concern obviously for my friend, who at the time we couldn't have been any more than 14 or 13, we were around that age. And the way he was treated and the way that the officers who were there were treating us, you know, saying, do you want to end up like him? And bearing in mind, they've got him up on the floor and you're essentially threatening us. And bearing in mind, we're just asking questions. No one's acting unruly. No one's, you know, particularly shouting. People are just saying like, what's going on? Like, why are you treating him like that kind of thing? And then after all that, it turned out they had the wrong person. And I think that was the most sad part about it is, you know, the accountability back then was even worse. You know, there's no body worn cameras. It was your word against theirs. Hardly ever, you know, you used to get the 50-90 slips. Obviously now it's digital, but back then you weren't getting no 50-90 slip really, unless you begged or you were going to make a complaint, then they might give it to you. But for the most part, oh, you don't want one, do you? Nah, you want to be on your way. And to be honest, I did, you know, but I, you know, and even days where I was repeatedly stopped more than once in a day. And I'll never forget the day when I was stopped 3 times. I was in 3 different areas, but the point was like, wow, I stood out 3 times today and I'm not wearing anything that should keep me from standing out. So yeah, it's mad. It's mad. Mad.
Yeah.
And that was just norm. That was the norm. As a schoolboy in London, that's just it. Yeah,
it's crazy. And you know, like that kind of repeated sort of stop and search, because the way I see it is like you've criminalized someone without them committing a crime. You look at them as if they're a criminal, and even if on the 1 in 100 chance you might find something on someone, the other 99 times it's a breeding a hell of a lot of distrust between particularly black communities or people that are stopped and searched a lot more and the police. And that was how 15-20 years ago, and then we fast forward to 2023 and that distrust is still there, even though we got body cam, we got digital 59 slips or whatever, but that distrust is still there. People don't really, especially people that come from these sort of communities, you don't really trust the police. It's like, what has changed?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I'll be the first to say, you know, we've had the Angoli review, we've had the David Lammy review, we had the review when Theresa May was in government, the review when David Cameron was in government, we had reviews with Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. We've had review after review. We had the McPherson report. I could name you, we've had Home Affairs Select Committee reports, we've had stuff from the Inspectorate on the Constabulary, we've had stuff from the IOPC, the IPCC. Before it was, I could list you hundreds probably of reports that have spoken about stop and search and have spoken about the disproportionality that exists. And ultimately, when you drill down to it, quite often police forces across the UK have been able to essentially move the garden pots around and go, oh look, there's something new, when really ultimately the same old garden pots they had before are just standing behind the new ones, and that's considered change. And if you reflect on it properly, you realize that it's no wonder that we keep having the same results, because ultimately structurally the system is built to target certain kinds of people. So I'll give you an example. If I'm a 40-year-old man, I work for Barclays Bank, and every day I get an Uber to work. Do you think you're getting stopped and searched in your suit on the way from Barclays? Doesn't mean that person's not carrying anything, by the way. And so, but we have a system where you know, we use certain train hubs. We go to Croydon Station, we go to Clapham Junction Station, and then we wonder why, you know, almost by forcing, you know, criminalizing all of those people. Of course, you're going to eventually find somebody, but if it's structurally going to work like that, of course we're going to keep getting the same results, and of course we're going to antagonize all of the innocent people ultimately who get tangled up in that. And it's just, to me, it's not good enough. It's not good enough at all.
Nah, not good. You keep telling someone there's something. Ultimately, a lot of people are just going to live up to the label that you give them, labeling theory that you keep telling them. And by doing stopping such random people, you keep telling them over and over again from when they're young, you're a criminal. Often people might just live up to be like, you know what, like it is what it is, like, and just go in and do what they're doing. So I'm not a big fan of that kind of thing at all. And still on this the youth sort of subject, something else that you're probably most well known for is your campaigning around, especially around knife crime. How did you get into that, and what was what's your relationship with that subject? Why was it that's something you're so passionate about? Yeah,
I guess obviously as a young black boy in London, you know, grew up around, you know, people who found themselves tangled up in that issue. So that was a kind of starting point. I think it was around it might have been around about 2012. I can't remember the exact year. Someone called Jeremiah Manuel, who's another inspirational guy, really top guy. He approached me. He wanted to pull together something called One Big Community, which was about building a youth-led coalition of young people and organizations who were passionate about the root causes of knife crime. So, not looking at what we seem to get over and over again, which is looking at how we police our way out of these issues. So the punitive measures, stop and search, arrest, okay, right, we've been there, we've done that. If you just keep trying the same things, we're going to get the same results, right? So it was about how do we really look at what the root causes were, what was underpinning it. And I think that was the start of, I guess, a more academic part of my life in terms of really getting to grips with what it is that young people felt were the issues. But more importantly, let's not just ask them what the issues are. What are the solutions? What are the things that you think are going to transform your life? And, not just in terms of, intervention for people who are finding themselves involved in those issues, but also in terms of prevention. What kind of space can we create for young people? I look back on the reports that we did back then and the stuff we did with people like Kenny Mafadon, the list, Temi Mawali. I can tell you all of those people, the same people are still talking on the issue now. We did all of that work, came up with all these solutions. We had the ears of, the current mayor of London at the time, which was Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. We had as all of the key players really around the table, all of the biggest youth organizations involved. And it still amounts to ultimately lip service. As a result of that, something called the Youth Violence Commission was created. And again, they produced an interim report on a report, very similar findings that came out of that. So you've got years and years of organizations, of young people, of practitioners saying the same thing. But that's where my passion sort of derived from. Unfortunately, Jeremiah lost a friend of his, and he just said, what, enough's enough, and I want to be part of the solution. I was just one of the many sort of campaigners that he contacted at the time, and we came together, and that was where it started, really. Yeah.
As you're talking, there's like a sense of frustration, because I feels like we spoke about like the trust issue, for example, over 15, 20 years. In your experience, in my experience, and probably loads of people that might be listening to this, and their experiences is like that hasn't changed or evolved. Then you're talking about how I think you say started in 2012, right?
Yeah. That was that particular issue. I've been speaking about it before, but that's when it sort of really came together, I guess. Yeah.
Approx like 10 plus years, over 10 years, and it's like that was then, and now we're now, and it's like, has the needle moved? Like, how much has really changed?
But I honestly, not much. I think if anything, the issues have been compounded. So we know we have things like the cost of living crisis, etc. But we were talking about child poverty back then, let alone the issues that have been, expedited by, the COVID and, as I say, the cost of living crisis. So if anything, not everything has got worse, but the issues have been compounded by all of these other things. And we know that actually when we talk about the approach that's needed, we always talk about the health, a public health approach, and that's basically thinking about young people in the context of their well-being, in the context of safeguarding them, because quite often when we talk about this issue, it's about the punitive measures, how can we lock people up, etc. But actually, when we know that the basis for young people being involved and engaged in some of these awful things is essentially a breakdown in most of the things that quite a lot of other young people can expect in their life. How can we continue on that same continue on that same track? And yet we have, we look at youth services, we look at social services, we look at all of the things that are in place, mental health services for young people, CAMS, all of those things that are supposed to be in place for young people to make sure that they can thrive and have at least a level playing field in terms of getting on in life. And most of those things are depleted. Look at the budgets for youth services. I think it's about £1 billion missing per year from youth services across the UK. And then we expect young people who aren't affluent, who don't have maybe the best kind of grounds to work from, to thrive in that environment. Let alone just do okay, but thrive. We expect them to thrive in that. To me, that's wrong.
On the youth services, like I was talking to my neighbour a few weeks ago. I don't know if he wants me to name drop him, so I'll leave his name
Yeah,
out. But if he listens, he'll know who it is. But actually, we went for a run. So I was running with him, and he was telling me that when he was growing up, he grew up in East London, and there was all sorts of youth clubs. He used to go to one particular youth club quite a lot. Regular guy, not like into anything, just a regular married man, regular guy now. He was like, he used to go to his youth club, and they used to go and play games and that. He said that the youth leader there used to like literally call him on the weekend and be like, yo, have you done your homework?
Yeah.
I'm coming to your house, let's go to the library. There'll be a group of them, and he takes them all library, and so it was more than that, just a youth club and the games, just like that community that comes with it.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why youth services are so integral, because they're able to be more holistic than anybody else. If your parents are, working 3 jobs or whatever it is they're having to do to survive, your teachers are focused on getting you your grades, they ain't got time to really focus on anything else, then where is that piece? And okay, you might, if you're very, very lucky, make it into a CAM service if you've got some sort of acute mental health issues. But if you're just struggling, like most people do, just general struggle, who is there to kind of wrap around and give you that more holistic care? And it was youth services. And I agree, when I was growing up, the reason I'm able to do and articulate myself the way I am, the reason I have the social capital I have, isn't from my upbringing. Because a lot of people do wonder, like, oh, what was your upbringing like? I didn't come from money. My parents would laugh at me if I even suggested I did. But it was those youth services that gave me a foundation for connecting with like-minded people, for supporting me on things that I was passionate about, supporting me when I was upset. All of those things come from youth services. And yet probably more than half of the services that I could expect to attend, back in 2010, 2007, that kind of period and before, where are they now? Most of them non-existent.
Getting
sad.
Military spend going up. That's another issue. I was reading about it recently, where they said that they're going to allocate, I forgot, quite a few billion extra into military spend and whatever. But yeah, maybe they're misallocating it.
But it's interesting that we can make a commitment that, for example, they always talk about military spend being a percentage of GDP and the amount that we put into NATO being a percentage of GDP. How about we create those percentages for the core services that we know we need young people and young adults to survive, to thrive, not to survive because that's the bare minimum, but to actually thrive. But there's no appetite for that, and that's one of the things that frustrates me. We talk sometimes about the government's finances as though it's like a current account, as though or you've only got £2 left in the account. So that's not how it works. It's a political decision to decide to defund youth services, because that's what no one really uses that term, but that's essentially what's happening when you talk about the fact that there is a depleted workforce of people. You can't even really make a career these days as a youth worker unless you're willing to work in one specific position for the whole of your life, and even that position might not be secure. So how are we supposed to build up young people if we can't even build up a workforce around them to support their needs?
It's within our best interests. These people are going to be the next leaders. They're going to be the ones running corporations and running governments and running communities and whatnot. It's within our best interest to make sure that they thrive as best as possible, for sure. But I guess not everywhere looks at it like that. Maybe they don't have that kind of a mindset or frame.
I think, look, ultimately, when we look at the media, and I'm pretty sure it's about at least 50% are from Oxbridge. When we look at our politicians, if we look at members of parliament, whether we look at councillors in local authorities, whether we look at the regional mayors, so we've now got, obviously, we've not just got Mayor of London, we've got the combined authorities. You look at every layer of government in the UK, and we look at the diversity of those people, and it's even worse when you include kind of their backgrounds in terms of private schools and stuff like that. So even the diversity we do have is actually, most of those people still come from an affluent background. If you look at that and you realize it isn't rocket science as to why across the political spectrum there's a vacuum of ideas for really supporting people to thrive, because many of those people have not, if you're somebody who's born into having the social capital, the people that will, they might not need a youth worker, because actually ultimately their aunt or their aunt's friend or the network that their family have can provide that support and can provide that confidence and that advice. Some people don't have those things. So, ultimately we have to build a system where people who don't have those things can get at least a baseline, an expectation that we have some sort of level playing field. And the funny thing is that it sounds like radical change, but it's not really. It's within grasp. It's not actually as radical as it sounds, you know. But ultimately, there just isn't the political appetite, and for me, that stems from just not being able to relate to the issues.
Oh, definitely, 100%. I agree with that, 1,000,000%. I want to take a slight sidestep, and talk a bit about identity. So, at work, well, last Black History Month, so we had an event. So there's a community at work called Be Proud. We had an event, and there was a panel discussion. What was I can't even remember what the discussion was on exactly, but there was a segment when they were talking about identity. And there was 2 different black men on there. And one of them was saying that, how did he phrase it? He said that he doesn't like going openly talking about his sexuality. He never leads with that because he doesn't want to be defined by that. So we just talk to people as if like, whatever. If they find out, then cool, great, whatever. Then there was someone else had a complete opposite view. He said he very much like celebrates that side of him. Is everywhere. If you know him, you know. Like he's on social media. He talks about it all the time.
Can relate to that. Two
very different, perspectives. And I do understand both sides. And then it's wondering from your perspective, a black man. What's your like? Do you lead with that? If someone asked you, who is Rhammel?
I mean, I think I'm just Rhammel first, but I think I've gone past the point of being able to go back into the closet, like ultimately my sexuality is Googleable, so I'm not going anywhere. And when I came out via a HuffPost article, and the article went very viral, so from that moment onwards I can't really take it back. I do think it's interesting though. I think that ultimately your identity is yours, and so ultimately you carve out the path that you want for yourself, but also I think in the context of coming out, even in the context of, as I say, you can Google who I am and what I'm about. Ultimately, in some ways it's a constant conversation, and not necessarily always through my own kind of wishes, but sometimes these things just come up. But also I find it very interesting that ultimately, depending on how you're perceived, on how you're presenting that day, people also have a perception of what your identity is. And I've had plenty of experiences. One particular experience stands up to me at a former workplace where this person essentially read me as straight for whatever reason, which to me is funny because I feel like I'm just me, and I feel like I'm just very open. And they decided to go on this very homophobic rant, and I just found it interesting to me because apart from it being very frustrating and quite violent, ultimately, because I'd been read as that way, somebody felt comfortable essentially to kind of almost sit in their homophobia. So I don't know, identity is a very interesting thing, but one thing I do think is that ultimately it's down to and that's why earlier I talked a bit about why visibility can't be the only thing we're aiming for, because some people don't need or want, some people aren't safe to be visible, but also there's a consequence to visibility. I talked earlier a bit about the abuse. I don't expect that everyone can or should and can, has the tools to navigate what that's like. And one of the things I'm always talking about passionately, and I think is connected to identity, and the reason I'm able to be so vocal is about collective care. The other reason I don't like talking about resilience is because it wasn't, for me, some of the most pressurized moments in my life were not about my own personal resilience. It was about the collective care that I could get from the many other people in my networks.
Collective care, like community.
Right, absolutely. But your own chosen community, the people who are in your life because ultimately they've got your back in some way. And that's why, I think sometimes we talk a lot about self-care. And don't get me wrong, obviously you have to care for yourself, absolutely. But for me, the most powerful thing is collective care. Who do you have in your networks that you're going to look out for, and vice versa? Who's going to have your back in those moments? Because sometimes, doesn't matter how strong you think you are, sometimes you just need somebody else to hold you up. And I reflect and pause on that and think that's why I can be so powerful in the way that I talk about who I am, because I know that I have that fallback, and thankfully, touch wood, I haven't needed it that much, but I know it's there, and that for me is where my power is from, and I think many of the people that are around me. And so, you know, I don't know, I think there can be sometimes a lot of glam around activism and being able to be so open about your identity. I think it can be glamorized, but it comes with a lot of hard work and a lot of risk as well. So yeah, I guess that's my own personal story of identity. But also, I guess connected to that is, you know, and perhaps unusually so for a lot of Black Brits, my family were very supportive of me when I came out, and ever since then they've continued to be supportive. And actually, for a lot of Black Brits, that's not the story. You know, the story of being homeless, of being disowned, of you know, constant ridicule, whatever it is, or of quite a strange and kind of stressful relationship. And as I say, I feel very privileged that thankfully my parents and my extended family accept me for who I am. And, you know, yeah, those things, as I say, are rooted in the power that I have, for sure.
Yeah. You know, on this identity piece, obviously you're a lot more than your sexuality.
Yeah.
You know, you're a son, you're, I don't know, all sorts of other things and
that for sure
you might want to attach to yourself. And also, you're obviously a very passionate, very driven, you know, very passionate person. You've got things that you've been campaigning and talking about and raising awareness on for since you were 11 years old. A long time. Like that journey of you sort of stepping into your power, embracing your identity, what's that been like for you? Like, is it something that you've consciously gone on, or it just happened through?
To be honest, I think because I was passionate and so much of my campaigning was public campaigning, I think it was a kind of a natural journey. But also, I think, yeah, some of it was just rooted in my own kind of need to use my own lived experiences and stuff in my campaigning and the things that I'm talking about and passionate about. So I think it was very rooted in that. And yeah, if I reflect on, you know, as I say, the way I chose to come out and all that kind of stuff, it was very much, do you know what, I want to own my narrative and I want to do something with that. And, you know, not long after I got involved in Pride in London. And one of the things that's quite interesting about Pride in London is a lot of people felt, well, like, wow, are you naive? Do you not know that Pride in London is a place that ultimately predominantly represented white gay men? And I had to just stop them in their tracks and be clear. I'm very aware of what Pride in London. I didn't get involved in Pride in London because I was proud of what the Pride movement in the UK looked like. I got involved because I realised that ultimately, if we don't have a Pride movement that works for the intersections of LGBT people in the UK, the most vulnerable people are going to be left behind. And to me, that wasn't good enough. And I recognize that I personally didn't need Pride as much as some other people, but there were plenty of other people who really do need a Pride that's going to stand up for them globally on the global stage. And so, yeah, I think for me, that was very rooted in what I was driven by at the time, and kind of, in that kind of early, that 2012 period that where, I clearly got passionate about a lot of things in that period. But yeah.
It sounds like a busy.
Yeah, it was 2013 was when I got involved in Pride in London.
You know, it's interesting you talk about Pride, and you ended up leaving that, and then you was at volunteering at Buy Pride, and then you left that more recently as well. So I was reading an article, so I wrote down a particular line from it. It's one you wrote about leaving Buy Pride. And you said, where was it? I thought it was such an interesting line about community. Where you wrote about communities being erased from the wider narrative of our community story, despite the many enormous and significant contributions of so many BIPOC people across the country. And then when I read that, it got me thinking about like 1,000 Voices in of itself. Because you're talking about it from that lens in Buy Pride, and then certain voices being left out of that narrative. And I was thinking about it in terms of like just the British narrative in general, a lot of black narratives and black voices and black stories just being left out. And, you know, like we spoke about at the start. And I'm wondering, with you leaving, Pride and Buy Pride, was it like driven by, well, I guess it was, you said it was driven by the fact that some narratives are being left out, but... Yeah,
I mean, the stories for those two organisations were definitely very different. For me, the story of Pride in London was I knew what my own personal visibility meant in terms of capital to that organization. I was one of the youngest and one of only 2 black people to have led Pride in London since 2012 as a director. And I knew what that meant, and I wasn't willing to be a curtain to the issues that I felt we needed to deal with. And we had, particularly a lot of people of colour who were also LGBT, but, strong black voices who were calling on Pride in London to be clearer about who it is that they needed to associate with, and making sure that actually our approach is intersectional. So, considering partnerships with airlines who are deporting people, or all of these things that cut across intersections. And Pride in London were willing to use my face and pay lip service to, off the back of things like the murder of George Floyd. But actually, when it came down to making sure that black people's voices weren't just heard in these particular moments in Black History Month, in these but actually that we're heard as an integral part of the theory of change in Pride in London, it wasn't there. And then on top of that, the kind of the way in which black volunteers were being treated. And I just thought, you know what? Too many people had left before me who either didn't have the security or the platform to speak out and say what I did. And I just felt, you know what, I'm tired of this being an open secret amongst LGBT organizations. It's time to put something on the record. And now people who are involved in the Pride movement have the tools to really hold Pride to account and say, okay, so what's happened since Rhammel and the many other volunteers and staff that left back in 2 years ago? What's happened since then? And they can be held to account from all angles, from their funders and their sponsors, from the Mayor of London. And for me, that's what that was about. For Bi Pride, it was very different. To me, that was about my own self-care and making sure that, ultimately, I, as somebody who's passionate, I'm not spreading myself too thin. That ultimately, there's a lot of work behind community organizing, and a lot of people don't realize that even just an annual event is a lot of hard work, getting in the sponsors, kind of pulling together the comms campaign, whatever it was. And I just decided, there are some things I want to focus on. And I want to build my own project this year, and I just needed to refocus my energy. So 2 very different stories, but I do worry because the people who might provide a voice to the things that I was bringing up don't want to engage in some of those spaces because they've seen what people like me have gone through, and I think, is it worth it? Is it worth it?
So what's the answer on getting more black voices? Is it like Black Pride, for example, things like that?
So I will always support UK Black Pride because I think there's a space for, as I said at the top of this interview, I think it's absolutely imperative that there's I think we need a bit of both. We need people who are willing to sit in some of those very white spaces and be at the table and make sure that actually that these other movements that claim to represent the wide breadth of our communities are actually representative. But I think we do need our other spaces where we can bask in our excellence, we can bask in our joy, and I get such great happiness from being in those kinds of spaces because I know that I don't have to worry about the racism and the other layered issues that you have to face in some of these other spaces where people are quite often well-meaning, but they don't realize that being well-meaning can have just as much impact as some of the most horrid and torrent abuse you can experience. And sometimes it's even more hurtful because you've spent the time, taken the time to kind of explain things time and time again, and things aren't moving. So yeah, for me, I think we need a bit of both. I think we have to recognize the power and the influence in the structures that already exist, and we can't I don't think we can exist as a subset and a separate kind of society because we are affected by those structures. So whether we want to participate in the conversations about stop and search or abolition and the way in which the criminal justice system, I think it's almost non-negotiable. And in a great world, we wouldn't all need to actively be involved. But in some ways, I think we all do need to be actively involved, whether that is creating a space for ourselves or hammering in the existing structures that perhaps don't seek to promote people like us.
Amazing. Cool. It's been great talking to you.
Been great.
We've got to wrap up in a second.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up, well, final question I should say actually, as we're wrapping up. What advice would you give to any other Black British change makers, people that are wanting to drive change in their lives, in their communities, just wanting to do some good stuff? Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would just say it's worth remembering the graft involved in community organizing, in campaigning. Note that people see me getting invited to the nice events and they think, you know what, I could get involved in that. And I think, but it's not the nice events that you've got to be worried about. It's me being up at 2 a.m. The day before an event, updating a spreadsheet. That's the kind of the grafting that's involved. So I think focus on the work that's involved. But secondly, it comes back to something I mentioned earlier, and I don't even apologize for repeating it. It is that collective care. It is creating that network and finding like-minded people who are going to hold you up, because we go back to kind of when I left Pride in London. When I left Pride in London, I put that statement out, and I even though I had a whole plethora of people behind me who supported me in writing the statement, who helped me. There were journalists that I spoke to get it out into the media, and they all did such diligent people that supported me. But ultimately, it was a very lonely moment, because it was only me. It was only my voice that was being put out there. I was putting my career at risk in some ways. And ultimately it was the people around me. It was, I think it was about 11 o'clock. The first person to call me was Phil Pokugima. And she called me and I cried. It was the first time I cried in the whole ordeal, because she just said, I've got you. And it was as simple as that. She didn't even really need to say much more. And she did, of course. And I think sometimes, again, when people want to engage in change making, they don't recognize just how lonely it is. And so I think for me, my main advice would be, it's that collective care and you choosing your network of people that you're gonna hold up, and they're gonna hold you up.
Nice. That's that, man. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. Much appreciated, man. Lovely conversation.
Thank you for having me.
No, anytime. Really appreciate you coming down.
For sure.
As we're wrapping up, have you got any last words? And also, if people want to keep up to date with you, the work you do, how can they best do so?
I'm prolific on social, so or you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm at Ramified on there. So just get involved in what's happening. There's plenty of opportunities to get involved in things. I'm always shouting about the different work and the charities that I'm passionate about. So if you follow me on those channels, you'll certainly see. It's so funny. I feel like I'm actually better at sharing other people's work than my own sometimes. So I have to remember that. But they can follow me on there.
Nice. All right, cool.
Awesome.
Thank you for coming on once again.
No, thank
Much
you.
appreciated. If you're listening and you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe. It really does help us in amplifying the voice of these people we get on, getting these amazing stories as far and wide as we can. So please do subscribe, like, share with your friends, and tell your friends to like, share, and subscribe as well. And that's that for now, people. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for coming to the podcast, Rhammel.
Thank you.
This is 1000 Voices. We had the amazing Rhammel Afflick on the podcast. And for now, we're out. Cool.
There we go.
That's it, man. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot. We covered a lot of ground in that.